Now, Reginald Bibby is a respected sociologist in Western Canada and has contributed significantly in areas of research. He recently began to grapple with the very problem that we're dealing with in our conference together: why people leave church, especially young students and young adults. And this was his conclusion: those relational links are so critically important that at the end of the day, my overarching interpretation is that the whole question of who will stay and who will go depends on people being able to define their involvement as worthwhile. Did you get that? His conclusion is whether we keep them or whether we don't keep them ultimately boils down to whether they consider going to their church worthwhile. Well, I'd like to have Tim Hortons with you and ask you, what makes going to church worthwhile for you? Do you ever come home Sunday morning at noon hour and turn to your wife and say, well, that was worthwhile going to church today? Why? What makes it worthwhile to you? For some of us, we saw some friends. For some of us, we learned something. For some of us, we engaged in some kind of significant ministry or service. And so we look back and we say that was worthwhile. But none of those come close to the one that preempts all of them. What's the major thing that makes going to church worthwhile? It tops them all. It eclipses them all. What's the major thing that makes going to church worthwhile? Here it is. It's an experience with God. It's an experience with God. James MacDonald's new book, it's called The Vertical Church. It's a very interesting book. The Vertical Church. And in it he says this: an encounter with God changes everything. And then his next sentence is this: that's what going to church is all about. Really? Really? Is that what going to church is all about? An encounter with God. Well, the challenge is, of course, that when you don't experience that, the tendency is to go. And the evidence from our research is that the reason why lots of these young adults and these young couples stop going to church is because they don't experience God. It's not an encounter with God. We tell them, for example, don't we, that God cares, that God comforts, that God guides, that God heals, that God provides, that God speaks. If you don't experience any of that, what would you conclude? Well, the younger generation's conclusion is this: either there's no God, or he doesn't care. We urge them to pray. We tell them that God promises to answer prayer. One person wrote, or the survey rather concluded, many young adults reported they walked away from church after the death of a loved one, parental divorce, loss of employment, failure in school, unplanned pregnancy, and any of numerous other life trials. They prayed. Nothing happened. They prayed. God didn't come through. What's their conclusion? Going to church isn't very worthwhile. Just doesn't do much. It's interesting, if you start to analyze this, as I've done since I've been working on this research now for 3 months. Every church service I've been to on Sunday morning, virtually every church service, oftentimes at the end of the Lord's Supper, any prayer requests. I can only remember one where they reported on an answer to prayer. Are we raising a generation of young people who are told to pray, urged to pray, promise that God hears and answers prayer, but we never tell the answers? We never report on the answers. What happened? We don't report on the answers. What's the conclusion? The younger generation measures truth and evaluates truth on the basis of experience. And if they go to church and they don't experience God, going to church isn't worthwhile, ultimately. Down the road, ultimately. So there's the challenge. People wander away from church, where you're supposed to encounter God, oftentimes without ever any sense that God is amongst us, God is with us, God is here. So what I want to do for a moment is just remind you of the enormous impact of an encounter with God. Abraham met God, changed everything. Jacob had an encounter with God in that wrestling match. It changed everything. Moses had an encounter with God, that burning bush. Changed everything. Joshua had an encounter with God. He was standing on the shores of the river, Jericho, and God met him. Changed everything. Elijah had an encounter with God, Mount Carmel, outside that cave. Changed everything. Isaiah had an encounter with God. He stepped inside the temple. He saw the Lord. David had an encounter with God. The bear and the lion will never forget it. Neither will David. See, an encounter with God does really change things. And it's the most significant thing that can happen when you go to church on Sunday. It's what, more than anything else, is going to make it worthwhile to go to church. You meet with God, you experience God, you encounter God. Changes everything. So my question to you is, what opportunities do you give to people in your church to encounter God? When you're planning a service, you're leading a service, you're working with a Bible class. What opportunities do you give them to have an encounter with God? Can you think of it? We sent our son, who went through some struggling years, came back to the Lord, got his life together. We sent him on a short-term missions trip with YWAM. He had an encounter with God. He's a different man. Life was radically changed. Some churches around the country are showing the film Courageous. And at the end of that film, they're giving men an opportunity to have an encounter with God, to make a commitment. Is that what's happening in your church? Is that what's happening with those young couples? With that teenager, that young adult? An encounter with God changes everything, changes the whole deal. I reflected on my life. I was 19 years of age, just finished high school. That next summer was one of the most miserable summers of my life because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where I was going to go. I was just struggling with my spiritual life. I was what would be called a fence sitter. My parents and friends weren't sure what side of the fence I was going to land on. Well, the last month of that summer, I went to Camp Minneoe. I worked beside Arnold Spears, and I had an encounter with God. Arnold Spears was a counselor about 7 years older than me, but 100 years older in spiritual life, character. And I came home from that experience with God, and that next Sunday, I went to the elders in our assembly. I was at Greenwood Bible Chapel at that time, and I told them I wanted to be baptized and to come into fellowship. An encounter with God changed everything. Labor Day weekend came. I went up to Sudbury with 3 other young fellas to a youth conference. The first night we were billeted in a home. The 4 of us got together, sat on our beds with our Bibles and had devotions. I wasn't used to that. Never done it before. They wanted to read the story of the road to Emmaus. And so I opened it and we read it and they discussed it. Just young fellas like me, but they were 100 years older. And I had an encounter with God that night. I met with God on the Emmaus Road. And I realized I saw a level of spirituality and godliness that I aspired to, attracted me. And I went home the next week and I registered to go to Emmaus Bible School. On Thursday night of Spiritual Emphasis Week, Harold McRae from North Carolina, or South Carolina, one of the Carolinas, was the devotional speaker. He spoke on Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord. It was the story of my life. And I met God that night. And at the end of the service, I just sat in my chair just struggling. A senior came over to me and he said, "Bill, would you like to pray?" We went downstairs, found a classroom, and the 2 of us got down on our knees, and I dedicated my life to God. I had an encounter with God. In the Bible class that we had at the chapel, about a month later, one of the men came and gave me A.W. Tozer's book, The Knowledge of the Holy. He said, "Bill, I think you should read this." Sunday afternoon, I opened it up. The first line said, "What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you." I said, "Well, that's not true. A lot more important things about me than that." I read the first chapter and he convinced me. Everything you do is a reflection of what you think about God. How you handle your money, how you handle success, how you handle failure, how you treat your wife, how you do your job, everything you do is a reflection of what you think about God. There's nothing more important about you than what you think about God. I read the rest of the book. I've read a few dozen books since then. It's still the most influential book I've read apart from the scriptures. What I'm saying, men, is this. There is nothing that makes going to church more worthwhile than having an experience with God, having an encounter with God. Is that the way you design your services? Is that how you pray before your services? Is that what you look for in your services? Is your part of your agenda to provide opportunities for people to have an experience with God? Why? Because an experience with God changes everything. And that's what I want to see to happen with the young adults and the young couples that cross our paths in our assemblies in the days ahead of us.